the reason that I wanted you to move up closer is so that we could feel like this is less formal, because I do want to try to encourage folks to kind of throw questions at us. Whenever you feel comfortable, you don't have to wait for us to stop or ask for questions or, something like that. You can just go ahead and interrupt us. And I want to start out, I can introduce myself again, Michael Koop with SHPO, and this is?
I am Steve Kohn. I'm the planning manager for the city of Red Wing. And I've been in the position of the staff liaison for the HPC for about 22, 23 years now. Whoa.
Everybody gets to go to sleep early. You had a big breakfast, you can take a nap now. So I'm going to start out with a few questions. I introduced myself and said I'm with SHPO. Does everybody know what SHPO stands for? Say it out loud. 4 words. Very good. Now, I'm the CLG coordinator. Does everyone know what CLG stands for? You all get an A. Good job. Jordan, in the back, the student from MSU Mankato, are you impressed with these students? You should be. They pay attention. In all seriousness, yesterday, one of my coworkers said that a person came up to them and asked, what's a CLG? And it doesn't surprise me, to be honest, because it is one of those things that I don't expect everyone to know. Not everybody that comes to the conference is from a city that has a Heritage Preservation Commission and is a certified local government. So, that's cool. But we live in a world of acronyms. And so we're going to throw, at least I'm going to throw some at you. Steve may as well today. And I apologize in advance for that. But, something like if I say NPS, that stands for National Park Service, because they're our partners in this CLG program. So I'll be throwing more acronyms at you regularly, but along those lines of questions as well, could I see a show of hands of if you are here representing a CLG? So it looks like about at least 2/3, 3/4. And this is a larger group than I kind of expected, but we have a lot of time. So rapid fire, I don't need to know who you are, but I want to know what cities are here from a CLG. So maybe starting over here, if you are a CLG, just you'll yell out what city you're from. Loud so everyone can hear. Thank you. Aaron is not with a CLG. Nope. Henderson. Great. Thank you. Next row. Stillwater. Okay, further in the back. Taylor's Falls. Anybody in the far back? Cottage Grove. Winona's here, yes. And moving forward this way. Thank you. All right. Northfield. Gaylord. And that's the way you pronounce it, everybody. Not Gaylord. Gaylord. Carolyn is with Duluth, but she's not on the HPC currently, but we're happy to have her sort of wearing that hat today. Otsego. And over here. Thank you. Carver. Nope. New Ulm. Kevin, Excelsior. Well, hey, there is Mankato and North Mankato, so yes. Anybody else in the back? Pipestone. Okay, so we've got a lot of different cities represented. I'll have a map in a minute that shows where those CLGs are located, but just by background, because a lot of you have worked with our office for a while, but some of you don't know us quite as well. Just as a little bit of intro about where SHPO fits. When the preservation program got started, technically in 1969 in Minnesota, SHPO became plugged into, we were part of the Minnesota Historical Society. And we were there until 2018, at which time we got moved to where we currently reside in the Department of Administration. So we're now officially part of state government. So we've been there for 5 years. And within our program, we have 4 teams that comprise SHPO. So there's Survey and National Register, the Environmental Review Program, Admin Planning and CLG, where I am, and then the Tax Incentives and Design Review team. So all the staff from those various program areas are here today. So just to give you kind of some background, here's the map that I mentioned. And I realize it's a little bit tough to read. I apologize, but when you have a big state, it's tough to fit them all in. But you'll notice that the majority are in certainly the southern half, if not the southeastern part of the state, very heavily weighted. I'd love to change that. And I think eventually we'll get some more up north, but that's just the way that things are for the moment. The photograph of the Winona Commission, I can't remember who's here. Aaron is here, I believe, from Winona. In any event, there's been some changes, and this is what happens many times with commissions. There's a lot of turnover. So the folks that you see in this photograph, some of them are no longer on the commission, which is why we do the conference every year and try to provide training for commission members, CLGs, because there's always going to be new faces and they need to learn things. And, you know, this is a good thing. It's good to have fresh faces and ideas and opinions and so forth. For background about the CLG program itself, it's a partnership between 3 entities, basically. The city that you represent, SHPO, where I am, and then the federal government. And within the federal partner program, it's the National Park Service that we work with, Department of Interior. And, you know, the program was set up as a result of amendments to the National Historic Preservation Act that Bonnie McDonald in her keynote referenced yesterday. So that dates to 1966. It's been around a long time. But in 1980, there were amendments to that federal legislation, primarily because a lot of local communities were starting to get a little antsy about actions that were happening in their own backyard that they had no way to comment on or weigh in and say, we don't like what's happening. We'd like to, you know, offer our opinions. So there was a movement basically from the grassroots level to allow communities to get involved. And this is the result, the creation in 1980 of the CLG program. And it's really, you know, a program that supports local preservation at that local level, but it formalizes it by literally having a contractual agreement between the city, the state of where I am, and the feds. So when a city applies to become a CLG, we have to review very particular information that's submitted to our office. That has to be approved by us, by me. Then I have to forward that to the National Park Service. They are technically the entity that signs off on it, that makes it legally binding. And then it literally is a contractual agreement between the city, the state, and the feds, which is why we do review the CLGs to make sure that they're, you know, basically enforcing the items that are in that contract year by year, so that they fulfill their obligations that are lined up there. And getting to the topic, you know, that we're talking about today, grants, the funding. What are the CLG grants themselves? Some folks aren't aware that this is actually a sub-grant program that, you know, technically the money comes from the feds that passes through to SHPO, then we pass it through to you, to the local community. So it's a sub-grant program that comes out of the HPF, another acronym, the Historic Preservation Fund. And one thing that a lot of people don't realize is that fund that the Park Service has, the money comes from what's called the Outer Continental Shelf Oil and Gas Lease Revenue Program. So it's not tax money. And so when we go during advocacy week to Washington, DC and talk to our congressional representatives, that's one of the things that we remind them about, is that this program is not stealing, so to speak. It's not taking money from hard-earned, tax dollars. This is a separate pot of money that's been set aside specifically for historic preservation. 10% of the money that is then sent to our office annually from those revenues that are generated from the oil and gas leases goes to the CLGs. So every year SHPO gets this pot of money, and then we're obligated to take a minimum of 10% of that every year to pass it on to the CLGs. And at the end of the presentation, I'll be able to show you a little bit more about the actual numbers and the grant deadlines and so forth that relate to that. So that's kind of the incentive. That's why a lot of cities apply to become a CLG, is the money, but it's not the only reason. The grants are open to any CLG. You can apply year after year if you want. I think, if I'm right, Red Wing has done that, where you've applied 1 year and come back the next year for another grant. So it's not something that you have to, wait a year to do. There's a 30% match requirement for the grants. Years and years ago, it was a 40% match. That's changed, and I'll get into more about the match in a few minutes. So the idea is that if you apply for a $10,000 grant, you have to have $3,000 of matching funds. And there are different ways to reach those matching dollars that I'll get into. The big catch with this grant program is that the money is reimbursable. And by that, I mean, we are expecting the city to be able to essentially front that money through their own budget initially. And then when the project is completed, we will reimburse the city. So you have to basically have the money up front. Frankly, for most cities, that's not an issue because they're dealing with $1 million budgets, and to come up with $10,000 or $20,000 in advance, not a problem. Would you agree with that, Steve? Yeah. He nods quietly, but yes, he agrees. So that's kind of a key point. It's not like a grant where we're giving you the money up front. It's basically after the fact. And the key here is that because this is a federal program that originates with the Park Service, there are requirements that the feds have in place. And this is not intended to intimidate anybody or scare you away or make you concerned, that you don't want to get involved. But the first 2 bullet points here are simply to reference, for your benefit, the documents that our office refers to when there are questions that come up that inevitably do. And these are online. When somebody asks about, is something eligible, under the CLG grant program? And trust me, I have these bookmarked on my computer at work, but I don't have them memorized. The grants manual is literally hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pages in very, very small fine print, and I don't have it memorized. Amy is smiling because we talk about this periodically. We do know sections of it better than others, but this is where I rely on my colleagues in Washington, DC, who do know the manual very well when I run into a question I can't answer. So those are there just kind of for your reference. The one thing that the next bullet point after that, the CLG manual from Minnesota, is the one that is on our website that you should refer to regularly if you're planning to apply for a grant. Let's see. And then after that, the next bullet references the Secretary of Interior standards. I mentioned that because those are the federal guidelines essentially that we are obligated to operate under, and the projects that are funded through the CLG grant program must meet those standards. And they apply across the board regardless of the kind of project. And then tying in with that, the final bullet referencing the Secretary of Interior's professional qualification standards goes to this point that many times when the funds are given to the city to work on a project, there may be an assumption that the city staff and the local preservation commission members are going to do all the work themselves. But many times, depending on the kind of project, you really do need to hire a professional consultant to work on that and do the project from start to finish. You can certainly have help from the volunteer commission members, but the way that the grants are, wow. I mean, is that like a sign that this is so boring that you really need to go to sleep now? I didn't anticipate the lights going out, so in any event, it's going to be a little harder for me to read my notes. Someone's going to check. So the professional qualification standards are there to make sure that when the consultant who's hired, that they meet those standards, that they are qualified to do the work, whether they are a historian, an archaeologist, an architectural historian, an architect, whatever that might be. So, Steve, do you have anything to weigh in on that? Okay. I missed at the very beginning saying that this is intended to be kind of a back and forth between Steve and I'm obviously hogging the microphone at the moment, but let's see. So the grant requirements, when a city applies for and gets the grant, there's typically an RFP that is sent out, the request for proposals. And this is what the consultants are responding to when they want to submit a bid to do the actual work. And the reason that I'm putting this slide up is that it's actually kind of a lesser known requirement, and it's one of those small details that you don't have to worry about so much right now. But if you get a grant, this is an often overlooked thing where within that RFP, the city is required to include specific language that is written here about the source of the money, the amount of the money, the percentage of the funds that are covered by the grant from the CLG program compared to the money that's being offered by the city, for instance, as cash match, et cetera. And I was actually going to ask Steve if you remember this from years ago. And this is, it's not a trick question, but there are some cities that forget to do this. And, I'm often having to remind them that in that RFP, and this is why I included St. Cloud's, they were really good about making sure that that language is in there. So, and this is also a reminder that some of you may be familiar with the Legacy Grants program that the Minnesota Historical Society has. That grant program has different requirements as far as their RFP is concerned. In other words, in the case of the CLG grants, if you submit a proposal and thank you, in the application, you identify a consultant that you're going to work with. You say, we intend to hire Joe Smith, archaeologist, to do this project. I'll probably write back and say, you can't pre-identify the consultant that you want to work with. The Park Service and the CLG grant program doesn't allow that. By contrast, the Legacy Grant program through the Historical Society, you can do that. You can have communications with the consultant in advance. You can essentially tell them, we're going to hire you. And that's okay to put in writing. But with CLGs and the CLG grants, you can still go ahead and communicate with consultants all you want. But in the written application, for some reason, that's kind of a no-no. Yes. Yes, did everybody hear the question about getting multiple quotes from different consultants in advance? We actually encourage you to do that. That's a really good idea. Let's see. Again, I don't expect you to read this. It's one of those other requirements when the grant is given that we are obligated, the city is then, because you're the grant recipient, to include these two paragraphs. It's just boilerplate language that literally doesn't change from year to year. That has to be referenced in whatever the final product is that is given or that's produced, whether it's a survey report from doing an inventory of buildings or a public education project, whatever it might be. So it's just one of those little reminders kind of to myself. So let's talk for a little bit about the kinds of projects that can be funded with a CLG grant. And I think many of you are familiar with, most of these, so don't need to go into a lot of detail, but feel free to ask questions if something comes up. And they're arranged in the order that a lot of times cities will do them, especially if they're a newer certified local government. So a historic context study is kind of like a background study that is a history of the community, looking at it from the built environment perspective. Those are often followed by surveys of actual buildings, whether it's in a commercial downtown area or residential. And if the city is big enough, it's probably necessary to do surveys over the course of multiple phases. I'm going to actually ask Steve to weigh in on that, because I think in Red Wing, didn't you do multiple phases for your surveys?
Yeah, we've used the CLG program, for intensive architectural surveys, and, other projects have come out of that. We've used them for cultural landscape reports that have then triggered other, more construction-based and preservation work as they go on. So we kind of use them as our initial grant funding program to get the project started. And so what I wanted to talk about today is we're currently in the middle of phase 2 improvements at Himanicha Barn Bluff Regional Park. And so we have a grant through the legacy program, through the DNR, through the Greater Minnesota Regional Parks and Trails Commission, that we completed a $1.8 million project a couple years ago. We're into the next phase where the G.A. Carlson lime kiln, which was on the Preservation Alliance of Minnesota, now Rethos, most endangered list back in the early 2000s. And one of the first things we had to do was do a cultural landscape report and a historic structure report. And we used CLG funding for that. And I believe at the time Mike's office was still at the Minnesota Historical Society, and they encouraged us to expand on the HSR, the Historic Structure Report, which we were funding through CLG, to expand that, because the bluff is so much a part of everything we're doing down there, and we have to look at it as a whole. And so we actually use the CLG program and a legacy grant to expand to a cultural landscape report, and really expanded our project that set the stone for our master plan for the park. And eventually another legacy grant that was close to $300,000 to preserve the lime kiln. And now our phase 2 project, another grant, about $500,000 through legacy, through the Greater Minnesota Regional Parks and Trails Commission, to actually interpret that preserved lime kiln structure. And so they put the footings in this summer. They're going to construct some decking and an overlook that's going to be there, create the interpretive signage that's going to go there, and we'll be wrapping that project up in the spring. So the CLG program is really what got us going, and it's been a process since the early 2000s to now. So, I mean, close to a 20-year project. So these can be smaller projects, like design guidelines, the book I have here that I brought with, that we use. It was done in the 90s, before I was still in college down here in Mankato. And oh, sorry about that. I get that at council meetings all the time too. And this thing we use all the time. Right now, we're working on a potential project in our downtown, and it's priceless and it's timeless. We had Miller Dunwoody at the time using CLG funds go through downtown, do historical research on almost every building in our downtown, and show us what the highest level of restoration would look like based on historic research. And, you know, there's a guide in the front that all of our members can use as they're reviewing, design reviews that come through, which we probably do anywhere from 10 to 20 a year in Red Wing. A lot of them are signage. A lot of the bigger work's been done. But you know, grant would do something like this that you're gonna use for multiple years. Or it could be like the project that the Gia Carlson Lime Kiln, where it was our first project to get the ball rolling for a longer project. I did have a list I was gonna bring down. I forgot it on my desk back in the office, but I think since I've been there, 2002, we've done 12 CLG grants, and I might have missed one or two. So we use the program quite a bit. We also use capital grant through the MHS for actually bricks and mortar. And sometimes these CLG, like Oakwood Cemetery, for example, helped us do a survey there, identify what buildings needed to be protected. We got it on the National Register, and then we got a capital grant to make some brick and mortar improvements to the building. So, and not to mention the scholarships. I hope everybody takes advantage of the CLG scholarship to come here every year. We usually send 4 or 5 people here every year using that program. So Red Wing uses it quite a bit.
I didn't have to bribe him very much to say all those things. So thanks, Steve. It also occurred to me just now that, more seriously, I mentioned yesterday that the conference will be in Red Wing next year. It's just purely coincidence that he's sitting up here right now with me talking about the CLG grant program. That happened. The decision to go there and the discussions about that happened well after this session idea came to mind, and I asked Steve to help out. But he touched on, in a really wonderful way, essentially all of the categories that are on the screen currently. And, you know, to the right, the visual is simply a reference that Stillwater quite recently updated their comp plan by having they did a separate historic preservation chapter for that comp plan, and that was funded through CLG money. So there's a range of projects and types of things that can be done using the funds. Steve also mentioned doing bricks and mortar work using capital grants from the Minnesota Historical Society, which is a good segue to pointing out there are categories of things that cannot be funded using CLG money. Lobbying is one of them. Doing any kind of mitigation for impacts on historic resources that result from an environmental review, including Section 106, that can't be funded. But then the bricks and mortar is the big one, because many times we get asked, you know, can a CLG grant be used, for instance, as part of a larger pool of money to put a new roof on a commercial building or change out the storefront on a property? And unfortunately, we have never provided bricks and mortar money through CLG funding. There are a few states that do operate that way, and that's their discretion, but they typically have a different mechanism and a source of other funding that can be brought to the table that allows them to do that. And we have just never been able to, primarily because if we opened it up for that, I can pretty much guarantee that, you know, we could easily give one grant to one building project, and then the money would be gone, and that's it. Because as you know, it's expensive to do rehab, period. It doesn't matter what the kind of project is. So that would not be fair, and it would really miss entirely the intent behind the CLG program to give money, distribute it more widely to as many communities as are eligible. Can't use CLG grants for fundraising, nor for curation and work with museums, but there are certainly plenty of other grants programs around that fit those categories. So talking about how to write a good application, some tips that come to my mind that I want to share. When you're working on an application, there may be natural partners within your city, and I recognize that there's some cities that are participating in Minnesota Main Street program. Many are not, that are CLGs, but if you are one of the lucky ones, they're certainly a partner to look to. for a variety of reasons. They can help promote the program and, you know, certainly help in other ways. There may be other organizations, whether it's the county or local historical society, that can pitch in. The conference here is a good example where, you know, if it weren't for Jessica working through the Blue Earth County Historical Society, we probably would have had a much larger lift for setting up the conference and making things happen here, because she's just a dynamic leader, and it was really great to have her help. The Chamber of Commerce is often an organization you can rely on or try to get help from, depending on the size of the city. So look to those groups, maybe even a foundation, whether it's a regional foundation or a local one, you know, they might be a good source of funding. A second pointer is to think ahead, to plan ahead, for a variety of reasons. Sometimes if you're looking to apply for a grant, your city council may need to be not only apprised about it, but they need to approve it formally well in advance, and it has to go in their budget. So if that's the case, you know, you might be looking at literally a year out for a project. And I understand that that's hard to plan for, but the idea is, you know, get it up here, start noodling on it, start talking to people. And if you have a staff person, you know, making sure that city staff connection is working into your benefit, so that they're the ones that are also talking to the council members or the mayor or whoever needs to hear about it, the city administrator. Third, you know, it's one of those adages that people think is silly to mention, but do read the instructions. Frankly, our application is really simple. And if you compare it with, you know, a lot of other grant applications, I think those are far more complex and not nearly as difficult to complete. But there are still some things that have to be addressed in our instructions that are easy to overlook. Fourth, look at your timeline and be aware of where there are deadlines, you know, whether they're internal that you create on your own or external that relate to the application process itself. And then another reminder is it does often help to get somebody who is not directly connected to the project you have in mind to be an editor or a proofreader and look at what you're submitting. I have actually gotten applications where the narrative, a paragraph has strike through or edits that have never been cleaned up. And it always makes me wonder, like, well, what were they really thinking of saying? Did they want to edit this out, or is this supposed to be in here? You know, and if that's the final application, that's what we have to work from. So, you know, just be mindful of that type of thing. And then finally, it's really good to consult with our office early on and submit a draft application. And we don't require technically that the city submit a draft application. But if we know about what you're thinking of doing, we really advise that you do that and go through the process and fill out the questions, you know, answer those questions, so that we get a sense of really what direction you're going and that you're covering all your bases. And I think Steve wanted to weigh in on this one as well.
Yeah, especially on the plan ahead. I don't know how many of you have huge budgets for your HPC. We don't. We get about $2,500 a year. And so if our commission wants to do a large project, we have to know at least, you know, by July of the year before we're going to apply for the grant, because their normal budget is not going to cover it. And so having that discussion early on with your city administrator and your council is really, really important for match. And we'll talk about match a little bit more and maybe some ideas on that. But reading the instructions, if you call up, Mike is always available. He's great. He'll be really responsive, get back to you. But you should do some of your own homework as well. And, you know, read the manual, read the state preservation plan, and make sure your project's meeting those goals. The draft application is a great service, especially if you haven't written a CLG grant before, or it's been a long time. They're going to tell you exactly what you need to address in it, but don't depend on it either. They, you know, their time's important also. So don't just throw something out there that's kind of half baked and expect them to write it for you. They won't do that. They'll suggest to you what those changes should be. But it's a great tool. And also talk to other cities and CLGs. I have other cities call me all the time asking about projects we've done, how we, what ballpark estimate, which in this environment is changing all the time. So you really need to go directly to the source with the consultants. They all seem to be busier than ever with all the legacy money available. Cities and counties are doing more projects than ever. But also to talk to, like Mike said, a proofreader. I also served on the grant review committee for the state of Minnesota for a capital and heritage partnership program. And so I've kind of sat on both sides of the table. And so I do have people call me, ask me to read through their applications and just give them some feedback on that. But I think it's really important to do that, to reach out to others. We're all on the same boat. We all want to see each other succeed. And just, that's why we're here too. Besides listening to all these presentations, it's to meet people and see what our common goals are.
Kind of along those lines, I'm pretty shameless about telling folks that if they've got a project idea and I have a grant from a previous applicant that's successful, then I won't hesitate to copy parts of it and send it on. It's the classic, why reinvent the wheel? Because I figure that city is probably going to feel honored to know that their application was good enough to share with someone. And if it got funded, that's a good sign that, somebody else can get the money as well. And then on that note, it's an overarching point, but I talked at the beginning about the amount of money, and we'll get into that again at the end. But the number of CLGs that you saw, we have 30, I'm supposed to have this memorized, but we did decertify 3 cities a couple of years ago. In any event, there's plenty of money to go around because in any given year, we generally end up getting only about 10 applications, despite the fact that there's close to 40 cities that could apply every year. And, you can do the math. If our office is getting well over 100,000, 120,000, somewhere in that neighborhood, the money is there for the CLGs to do the projects. And so my point is the competition is not that stiff. And if you have a good application, you're going to get the funding. And by contrast, if you're looking for legacy grants, if it's a good project, you have a good chance of getting funding from the Minnesota Historical Society. However, I can guarantee you that the competition is going to be a whole lot steeper with that program. That's just the reality of it. On any given, year or quarter, the cycle that they have with their small grant program of up to $10,000, they just have a lot of organizations that are applying. And so that's just the reality of it. So when you think about a project, selecting one good rule of thumb is that if your city has a preservation plan already, it's a good idea to follow the recommendations in it. A lot of times folks just come up with an idea that sort of pops out of thin air. Nobody really knows what the origin is, but if it's rooted in a document, you can make an argument much more successfully that this is why we are thinking of doing this project. It ties back to our preservation plan. Absent a local preservation plan, Steve referenced, thank you, our statewide preservation plan. And if you didn't, I hope you were able to pick up a copy of our plan that we were distributing. We literally gave away a lot of them yesterday. And so if you didn't get one, let me know. But the point is, the grant application has to tie back to that statewide preservation plan. You have to address specific items in that. So that's an important thing to do. Thirdly, thinking about the project, you really need to identify something that fits in with your local CLG. So if you've already surveyed all of the buildings in town, obviously you don't need to focus on anything relating to that. You can take the next step and maybe think about, well, which ones should we designate? Is that, wise? Is that a good next step? And is it responsible for us to do that as a CLG? Probably, yes. It's also a good idea to try to be proactive like any of our work, rather than having to react to the threat to the resource, that came up at the 11th hour, that you're having to respond to. And I understand that our work is often reactionary. That's the nature of the work sometimes, but it's good to try to be proactive and think ahead. And then finally, if you're thinking about a project, be realistic and make sure that, the local government itself, your city administration, will support it. Because the last thing I want to do is back you up on a project and then find out after the fact that the city council shot the idea down because they didn't know about it, or it wasn't within the realm of what they figured would make sense to do. So things to keep in mind. And by communicating with your local officials, elected and otherwise, city administrators, that's simply going to build good relationships between the HPC and then the city government, and it just makes for common sense to be able to do that. As you plan for the project, it's good to think about certain items that I'm going to tick through here, different bullet points. First is, what is your long-term outcome? What's the goal of the project? Again, it goes back to, maybe you should talk with us to think about the next, whatever that goal might be. Next, what are the standards? And in this case, I'm referring to the Secretary of Interior standards that have to be met. And those change depending on the project. So the Secretary of Standards have an entire section relating to historic context reports. There's another section that refers to doing surveys of buildings, things like that. So it ties back, and it's good to be able to reference those accurately. Think about who is actually going to do the work for the project. I mentioned already that a lot of the times there's an assumption that the consultant that you hire will do everything, but some of the consultants actually enjoy interacting with the commission as well as members of the public, and there may be public engagement that's involved. There may be opportunities for the commission members as volunteers to step up and help a lot. So you have to think about that, and whether that is going to play out. And then it also helps, we touched on this earlier, and the question was raised about, getting estimates, thinking about the dollar amounts from the consultants. What will they expect to be paid? Kind of touched a little bit already about your broader CLG program and how the project might fit into the overarching goals with that. The timing is something that you, I think, have to pay closer attention to than you may initially think about. You just have to be realistic about the time and the amount of time needed from start to finish. You essentially have less than 2 years to do the project, to complete it. So you have to really, budget for that. And certain grants have different requirements. Melinda is sitting in the back from the Minnesota Historical Society, and it reminds me, seeing her, that there are some cities that apply for a legacy grant that matches the certified local government grant. The timelines, though, for each of those grant programs may differ. So there might be a deadline that Melinda has through the legacy grant program that's going to be a little different than ours. And it's just good to make sure that if you do something like that, and even if you don't apply for legacy, that you have the timing and the timeline in mind. And then finally, we touched on this a little bit already, but the match is, an essential ingredient for any of the grant, any of the CLG grants, and the kind of match that you're going to be using. And it's a big enough topic that I want to delve into that a little bit deeper for a minute, because there are often questions that come up about it. So as I mentioned, the CLG grant can cover 70% of the costs, and then the 30% balance has to be from local match. What kind of match? One is in-kind volunteer hours, whether it's the commission members or staff, just like Steve. And so if it's Steve contributing his time, that's factored as his salary, literally, plus benefits, by the hour, and that's great. If it's the commission members, it's essentially their volunteer time. And those are numbers that go into the sheets that are submitted to us periodically, but also at the end of the grant. So those numbers are going to differ. Maybe there's match that the local government will have. Steve mentioned that, you know, the commission in Red Wing gets a certain budget. What did you say? 2,500. So there may be money from that annual appropriation that the commission gets that they can put aside as, you know, match for the particular grant in that year. We've touched on other sources, legacy grants from the Historical Society being one of them, as a possibility. And then frankly, there are some cities that actually do fundraising. You know, it may sound silly, but they resort to that very successfully, as a source of match. The one thing is that you can't match one federal grant to another. And because the CLG grants are technically federal funds, that isn't something that's allowed. The exception is community development block grants or CDBG funds. And I threw that in because it is allowable. It doesn't happen very often. I honestly don't remember a city that did this and used CDBG money, but it's partly because of the source and the fact that you're dealing with another agency completely within the state of Minnesota if you're doing that. So not likely to happen, but just in case. Let's see. So we're going to be able to move through this a little bit more quickly. The next half dozen or so slides are literally the questions that you would see if you were filling out the application for a CLG grant. So one of the first big questions is that you have to describe why you actually picked a particular kind of a project and what, you know, why is it a priority? And it kind of goes back to how does that fit within the long range plan of the commission? And this is going to vary, you know, from one place to the other. Steve's been doing this for a long time. The city of Red Wing has had a commission for many, many years. They're going to be in a completely different position than, you know, a city that's relatively new that hasn't done a lot of work or hasn't even gotten a grant at all. So looks like you've got some. Oh.
Well, I'm actually back a page yet. One thing I wanted to mention on the in-kind volunteer hours, it depends on the project. We did historic podcasts, like 21 of them a few years ago, where the commissioners were really involved in the project. They wrote the scripts. We went out and we got volunteers from our local Phoenix theater group to read, to do the voiceovers. We recorded it and worked with Daniel Hoisington on it. And so the match was it was very necessary to record staff time and volunteer time. Just because we couldn't make up that dollar amount, the cost to work with the consultant, with the recording studio. But our last grant came out of that CLR project I talked about earlier, that recommended that we do a new nomination form for Barn Bluff, which is already on the National Register, but it was really lacking with content regarded to the significance of the landmark to our Native American community within Red Wing and other Native American tribes in the area. And with that one, most of the work was with the consultant who, you know, we're not able to write a National Register nomination form. And so we went out, hired a consultant, Two Pines Research, that did a wonderful job. But in that case, besides meeting with our commissioners a couple of times to have them review it, to me, it wasn't worth the hassle to get 7 different timesheets and tried to incorporate that into our grant, because our cash match was already there and the time that I knew I had to spend on it was already there. So it really depends on what type of project is. The volunteer match is great. I think when I started doing this, it was like $10-15 an hour, maybe, that you could get an HPC member's volunteer time. And now it's 34. That makes a huge difference in your match. And it's a great tool to have, because a lot of them don't allow your staff time or your volunteer time to be incorporated. It has to be cash. But this program, if you don't have the cash and you know you're going to have that volunteer effort, it's a great tool to get that 30% match that you need.
Yeah, and if it isn't clear, because I sometimes talk in circles or it's muddied, the match cash that I'm referring to, like from the legacy grant, that's really where, that's the point of getting that. It's to allow the legacy grant to cover that match funding, because it's literally just an extra check that goes into the budget. So you don't have to rely on those volunteers to use that time. But as Steve mentioned, you know, going back decades, there was sort of a standard number that we used. It was $10 an hour to count the volunteer time. But Minnesota is one of those states that is really fortunate across the nation. There's a nonprofit organization that calculates the volunteer hourly rate by state, and Minnesota's is literally one of the highest in the nation. So it's right now at $34.47 an hour. So for those of you that applied for a scholarship to come to the conference, you know, we calculate, we are letting you count the amount of time that you drive coming here and getting home and spending here at the conference. And that's all rated at that hourly rate of $34.47 an hour. You know, that adds up very quickly, but it's going to fluctuate. So next year it might actually be a little less. But there are other states where it's considerably less than that. So we're very lucky here. Thinking about the project team, we've again kind of touched on this a little bit already, but you need to know and identify who is going to be involved in the project. And specifically, if it's commission members, what role will they play? If it's the city staff, you know, what are they going to do? If it's the consultant, much more importantly, what are they going to do? I don't know that we have anyone that I remember from the intros. Is there someone here from Waseca? Sorry, I forgot that you were here. In any event, the city currently has a grant project that is a little bit unusual because they're working with the public school and a teacher to develop a curriculum that also has a podcast component, essentially, if I remember the project correctly. And my point is, that was a more complicated project, thinking about it in terms of the team, the membership, who was going to do what, how much time they would spend, et cetera. And so I had to spend a little bit more time, you know, working with my contact at the city when they were thinking about that. And it was also because they had multiple sources of match that were being brought to the table, which is a really good thing. But the point is, that made it more important to clarify all that in the application. Who's going to be doing what? How much time will they spend? And that type of thing. Actually, describing what the project is the next step, you know, where you propose and say, this is what we're doing. The reason that I include this, it's obviously one of the questions that you have to deal with, but it's important to remember that the reviewers of the applications don't know your city the way you do. We don't know the project the way that you've been thinking about it. You are intimately familiar with it. You know it really, really well, but we don't. I may know more about it because I've been talking to you about it, but I certainly don't know it the way that the locals do. And so it's really, really critically important that you describe it in detail and provide some context for us and background information about how you got to where you are, why you want to do this project, you know, where does it fit within the bigger picture, and then just go into detail about what you're planning to do. It's kind of asking that question, what is the problem that you have that you're facing, and what are you going to do to solve that problem? That's kind of one way to look at it. What's the project, and how does it, you know, resolve that issue, whatever it might be. The next item is the timeline itself. This is where you have to touch on the milestones, talk about the sequence of events that are going to occur. And that can include notifying our office at the very beginning, for instance, when you've identified a consultant. So after the project, you know, goes through, the RFP is sent out, people submit for it, you've picked somebody, you're technically required to notify us. And it can be a simple email to just say, okay, this is the consultant we've got on board, and then we know, and then the project is going to begin. There are also monthly progress reports that have to be submitted to us. And it's a very simple online form. You know, it doesn't have to be anything complicated. Sometimes they're just sent in with a few sentences because there isn't much to report on. But that's just something that's one of those requirements. It's important to keep in mind that you have to build into the schedule, in a bigger picture sense, time for us to review whatever it is that's being submitted, particularly if it's a draft document. So Steve mentioned, for instance, this revised National Register form that they're doing in Red Wing. I'm not the National Register expert in our office. We have two people that are doing that. And in this case, it really required getting David Mather, our National Register archaeologist, to review that. But I needed to make sure that David was aware that this was coming, because the communication was really technically coming to me. And then eventually we realized it made more sense to have Steve communicate directly, or the consultant communicate directly with David, because he'd be the one reviewing it. So it kind of depends on the project, but the point that I'm making is that we do need to make sure that our staff are given an opportunity and the time to review whatever that product is, particularly at the very end, because there's a requirement, that the project has to be wrapped up and paperwork submitted for it to be completed. And if we haven't had time to review it, then that's a major step that's been missed. So there's another question that you have to answer that relates to the community impact, the public benefit, and the outreach. So those are all items that you have to touch on. And, this is going to sound like a broken record, but it does depend on the kind of project, that how you answer this particular question. So, if you're doing a survey of buildings, for instance, one of the benefits of that obviously is that there's new data that's generated, and that's going to benefit not only the local community, because from a long range planning perspective, it's great that you now have this data set of all the information about these particular buildings, but it benefits our office because we get all that information. Those inventory forms come to us, they go into our database, which means we get, to see everything that the local community has been surveying. But if you're doing a project like a podcast, there's a completely different set of folks that are going to benefit from that, starting from teenage kids that are reading or listening to podcasts, if that's something they do, to the general public that's, touring through your town, or someone that's looking at it online that's 1,000 miles away. So you really have to think about who is going to be benefiting from this, depending on the kind of project itself. The final product, it's kind of an obvious one, but again, it depends on the work, the nature of the work. So if it's a survey report, that's, the survey of the buildings, then to use that example yet again, there's often a report that's, the final document that may be literally a list and inventory of the addresses of all the buildings, like a large table. And now our requirements for submitting all that are different than they were a decade ago. We require all that electronically. The inventory forms have to be submitted electronically. But it's sometimes useful to have a paper document as well. So those are the kinds of things that have to be worked out in advance. Enough said about that. There's some attachments that can be submitted to help your application as well. If you have an estimate, for instance, or a proposal that came from a consultant, it's okay to reference that, maybe just some general information. But again, as I mentioned, you really can't say that, consultant Smith will be doing this work and they said it's going to cost this much money or whatever. You have to be a little bit more coy about it. But submitting photographs, things like maps, those are really obvious. If you're doing a survey, it's good to have a map that shows the boundary of the geographic area that would be included. If you have a plan that references doing this kind of project, it's really great, to be able to quote from that. And then even getting letters of support, which frankly don't happen very often. But if you've got your Chamber of Commerce involved in the project and they're willing to write a letter that says, we are really behind this and we think it's going to be a great idea for these reasons, then by all means, have them send in a letter backing you up on this. I think that would be terrific. It tells us that there's buy-in from the locals, for one thing, and it just demonstrates that you've kind of done your homework and are working with other outside organizations. So in the grant review process end of things, this is kind of more of you getting to look behind the curtain to see what's the wizard doing. The application is technically processed by multiple staff depending on the particular nature of the project. So, you know, Steve mentioned the National Register nomination for, I still say Barn Bluff. What is it again?
Himanicha Barn Bluff. So it's Dakota and English.
Himanicha. We want to be respectful, but that nomination, as I mentioned, is not my area of expertise. So I had to have David Mather review that application. You know, one of our colleagues in the department. So there are different team members that will be reviewing the application depending on who it is. We have to score them on a 100-point scale, and that's basically mandated. Pretty much every state across the country does it the same way. Then afterwards, we just do a confab and talk about which applications look, you know, really solid. And, you know, as I said, many times, unless it's just a bad idea or a poorly conceived project, it's likely to be given a favorable review and a thumbs up. But there are years where we do decline applications and we can't fund them all. There are also years where we get too many applications, or the amount of money rather is too high, and we have to award a grant, but perhaps we have to ask that the project budget be reduced. And sometimes that's, you know, acceptable, and other times it's not. And then we do a set of recommendations that Amy submits to our State Historic Preservation Officer, who is really the final decision maker, and they sign off on it. And then, you know, we're good to go. And then from that point, it goes into the next phase, working with our Office of Grants Management. Speaking of grants management, some more tips to consider. Again, this is going to be sounding a little bit redundant, but, you know, communicating with different key players is really, really important. So some of you are here wearing the hat of staff person. Many of you are here wearing the hat of commission member. So if you have that commission member hat and you want to have a project in mind, you can go back, and if there's a city staff person you are working with, you really need to talk to them about, you know, what you have in mind for a project. It's great to talk to us, but they're the ones that really have to shepherd the thing through. So you got to make sure that you're, you know, in simpatico with those folks. And not just the city staff person, you know, like a Steve Kohn. What about the city administrator? Maybe they're going to play a role. Maybe there's a clerk who plays an important role within the city for a variety of reasons. Folks that are dealing with the budget, they all need to be aware of this, of what you're planning. Nobody likes surprises. So that's kind of the bottom line. And again, it's a good way to build relationships between all these various players. A second idea is that with regard to the funding, you really have to be careful about making sure you're tracking, you know, where the money is going as the project moves along. So it can often seem like a really obvious thing, but, you know, who among us is not guilty of procrastination at some point? Steve mentioned a few minutes ago that there was a project where it didn't make sense to involve the commission members and their volunteer time and all that. Part of that is because that requires having timesheets filled out, and we have a form for that. We make it easy, but it's also really easy to forget to get those forms filled out. And if you don't, you have to literally go back in time and kind of recreate, well, we had that one commission meeting, but Bob wasn't there, but Carol was, and I can't remember how much time they put in. And then you have to kind of make up hours, and it's really complicated. So, you know, you just have to track that stuff, you know, from month to month, week to week, and just make sure that it's all there. It's good to be proactive. Just like if you know that the commission members are going to be participating and you've got a regular meeting coming up, be proactive. Bring those timesheets there to the meeting so they can fill them out at that time. A third reminder is to set reminders for yourself about what needs to be done and when. And whether that's putting notices in your phone calendar or on a calendar in your office or, home, wherever it is, it's just simple, common sense thing to do is to just, make sure that you're aware that you've got deadlines coming up about something, and make sure that those are there. And then finally, and it's going to sound really silly, but you really need to be careful that you spend the entire grant that you get. And I'm not making this up. We've actually had cities that don't, and they tell us at the end when it's too late, well, the consultant only wanted to spend $9,800 out of a $10,000 grant. So we've got $200 to give back to you, Mike. And I'm like, oh, you think that's great, but it's in reality the last thing I want to deal with, because this is not good to have a balance left over. Nobody likes these little amounts of money. It all needs to be spent. That's what the grant is for. So if you have a bid from a consultant and it's a little less, be generous. Tell them, go ahead, bump it up. You can buy an extra Christmas gift for your kid or whatever. It's just a lot easier to do it that way. Would you agree, Steve? Do you need to comment on that? No. And I'm not saying that because they did anything wrong. It's just, that's the way. All right. Got to hurry along here if there's any questions. Sorry. Grant management, what you're looking at is that request for reimbursement form. At the beginning, I said that the grants are reimbursable rather than you get the funding up front. This is the form that you would submit. This is typically done in conjunction with the final report that kind of summarizes the project that has been completed. There's also the in-kind and donated labor forms that are submitted that I've touched on already, and then the monthly progress reports that I alluded to a minute ago. So there's a group of people that are involved typically in any CLG grant. Myself as the CLG coordinator on the left side. The project specialist refers frankly to if there's somebody, a team member from SHPO that would be involved in, whatever it might be. Sometimes I wear that hat, but not always. And then there's the contracts specialist really refers to within admin, and then the larger state organization, there's the Office of Grants Management. So there's a person that we interact with that helps us administer these grants. On the other side, at the local government level, there's someone like Steve from the local government staff. Then you also typically hire a consultant, and then the commission. So it's these two groups that are kind of working side by side. Kind of final words here, wrapping up. This is the more or less finalized timeline that I've come up with for next year's grant application cycle. And the reason that I included it today is because now is the time that you should be starting to think about a grant proposal. It's never too early. We're almost into October. If applications are due mid-January for a draft application, that's really not that far away. If your commission is only meeting monthly, if you have ideas, you can certainly talk amongst yourselves, separate from the monthly meeting, but there's a certain amount of time to get these ideas in place. And now is the time to start thinking about them. So there's your timeline. And then, as I mentioned, we typically have roughly 120, 125,000. It varies from year to year, depending on what we get from the National Park Service. As far as our funding goes, we don't know exactly right now. So that's just an estimate. But again, that gives you an idea of, how much money there would be for all the various cities to apply to get. So I think we're close to being out of time. And I know Steve would probably be happy to answer any questions. I certainly am able to. Amy is coming up, which tells me that I either missed something completely that she wants to touch on or something else.
No, Mike did a great job. I just wanted to put a little plug out at how important these deadlines are, especially the final reporting piece, because this is pass through money through the federal government. We have to report annually the activity of that year. And it gets really complicated for us because we have 2 or 3 federal grant awards going. They're staggered. So we are reporting on 2 or 3 federal grants every year. So that is why that July 31 date is so important for those closing materials. Because this is based on the federal fiscal year. State fiscal year starts July 1, but federal fiscal year and our reporting of these grants is an October 1 through a September 30th cycle. So it gets really complicated on the state side and our reporting gets really fun. But the one thing is, if you have a grant project that spans over 2 years, you've got to report your spending that first year according to the federal fiscal year cycle, if that makes sense. So we need to know what you spent that first year of your grant. You've got to do the reporting. It's not closing it out, but you've got to report to our office what you've spent in that first year of the grant. And then we need to know what you spent in that second year. That includes in-kind time and match money. So that's why these deadlines are really important. It gets a little murky. We want to make it simple for you all, but I just want to put in that plug. And especially with scholarships, if some of you are here on scholarships, please get that reimbursement paperwork in right away, because we're way past July 31, right? And the end of this federal fiscal year is tomorrow. So you're hearing all this conversation about federal shutdown and everything. We're okay, by the way. The SHPO office is funded through these historic preservation funds. If you have a past grant, if you're working on a 2022 or 2023 grant award from our office, you are also okay because that money is not affected. So just wanted to mention that.
Thank you, Amy. Questions? Carolyn? The question was, can a CLG apply on behalf of a nonprofit? And the answer is yes. The nonprofit can certainly be heavily involved in preparing the application, but the application does need to come from the city proper. Yep. Yes. Yes, you can use that time, but it relates to the CLG grant itself. So the deadline for it would be the timeline for the grant proper. There's some debate about if you were meeting as a commission in, say, July and August, and the grant technically didn't start until September 15th or somewhere around there, whether your time could be counted. And technically it can, even though the grant work has not officially started. It's a little more complicated to report it, but you can include that. Yes. You can have more than one. It's not common. And as the guy that gets to decide, I reserve the right to say it depends on the kind of project. But no, more seriously, we have had a few years where we have not been able to award the minimum amount that we're required to, and we've actually had a second round of grants. And there have been a few instances where a city that applied for successfully and got a grant in the first round came back to us during that second round that was advertised, later, and they were awarded a grant under that second round. So that's allowable. Other questions over here? Anything else you want to add, Steve? Red Wing says no. It's time to eat, he says. Thank you.